Good evening. My name is Gloria Chukwu, Chair of Africana Studies. I am delighted to welcome all of our guests, our UMBC students, staff, faculty, and senior administration, including President Rabowski and Dean Kasper. I'm honored to have all of you here. This year marks the 52nd anniversary of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. And since the inception of the United States, immigrants and their communities have remained the pillars that hold this country. We cannot underestimate the strength of immigrants from African continent. And so today, we'll be hearing a tiny piece of that strength that has helped to shape the United States as it is today. I hope you are as excited as I am. But before we proceed with the program, I have a few important announcements to make. Every February, Africana Studies Department takes UMBC students to a 4-day summit in Washington, D.C. There, those students serve as diplomats representing different African countries. They have the opportunity to be briefed by ambassadors from different African countries. And of course, they have the opportunity to learn about contemporary issues of interest to Africa and African countries. They also have the opportunity to socialize and expand their networks, connecting with faculty and students from institutions of higher learning in North America, South Korea, Africa, and Europe. So if you're interested, how many of you are UMBC students? Okay, if you're interested in diplomacy and in learning about contemporary issues facing Africa and having the opportunity to interact with ambassadors, please, there is a sign-up table outside. Before you leave, write your name and leave your contact information, your email. We've started preparing. The summit is on February 22nd through 25th next year. One other important announcement I want to share with you is that on March 26th, Africana Studies will be hosting its second annual Taste of Africa. This next year we'll be featuring Africana Studies Alumni Roundtable. If you love African food and enjoy African music, it is an opportunity to come out and enjoy with us. Finally, Africana Studies will be hosting a conference on May 8th through 9th, 2018. The theme of the conference is on women and the Nigeria-Biafra War, reframing gender and conflict in Africa. Please, you are encouraged. I have some flyers that I will leave out there. Do pick one. And the UMBC faculty, staff, and students are free to sign. You have the information, a link, you click, you register. And you will be treated. There will be a gala night on the last day of African music and dance. So you are welcome. Now it is my honor, pleasure to welcome President Rabowski to make some few remarks.
Join me in giving Professor Chukwu a round of applause for her leadership of the department. And I want to begin by welcoming our guest today, Professor Falola. who brings both a kind of fascinating scholarship and, I would say, a remarkable humility given all that he's achieved. So we are looking forward to listening to you today. I thought I would begin by giving you my sense of the significance of this department and of the future of those who are touched by this department. Are there some alumni in the room still? If there are some alumni in the room, stand up. Let me see the alumni. Give them a round of applause, would you please, those who are here. And they're representing fine professionals. What you may not know is that we have students from this department who have gone on to be judges and lawyers and social workers and scholars, humanists, teachers, a range of areas. And the other one that few people may know is that we've had people out of this department to get into diplomacy. Because the advantage we have at UMBC is you are learning how to work with people from almost 100 countries. And you get a sense you're dealing with different languages, different cultures, and many of you go back and forth the countries. If you have either a parent from another country or you are yourself from another country, stand up right now. Let me see how many are in the room. Stand up. Of any race, of any nation, stand up. Give them a round of applause. I might have been better if I just said, if you didn't come from another country, you stand up. Interestingly, some of you were at the first year experience and you saw when we had the convocation that about 45% of our new students have that international. There's something at a time when our country is struggling to show the world who it is, at a time when people at so many levels are questioning the significance of the American dream of pulling people from all over the world. And at a time when we are needing people to stand up and say, we believe in our children, wherever they are from, the work of all the UMBC departments that focus on culture, from Africana Studies to all the others, language and culture, English, all of those that are doing it, that work is more important than ever because you will be called on to speak the truth to power in different ways, as I have to when I'm in Washington right now. And sometimes it is not popular, but it's the right thing to do. Du Bois was the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard. The first PhD in the country was Boucher at Yale. Boucher in 1876 became the first black, and he earned a PhD in physics. Could not find a job, died poor. They finally put something up in a headstone. They finally gave him a grave there in recent years. But unlike Boucher, Du Bois had the opportunity to go all over the world, was born the year of my beloved Hampton in 1868, died in 1963, the year I went to jail with Dr. King. I've always related to Du Bois. I've always had ways of thinking about it. I always was struggling with that notion of the talented 10th when people said it was an awful idea. I don't think it's an awful idea. You are the talented 10th. There is no limit to the numbers who can be. It is metaphorical. It is the idea of the best. It is the best. And this is what I want the women in the room to hear me saying. If you don't know the name Shirley Graham Du Bois, I want you to Google that name. She was the second wife of W.E.B. Du Bois, an Oberlin graduate who actually taught at Morgan a while, who did some work at Howard. But most important, she, after Oberlin, went to the Sorbonne, became a musicologist, a singer, and most important, quite frankly, she became somebody heavily involved in Pan-Africanism. And that's why I think about her today, as our scholar is here. If you go and look, you'll see she was a biographer for Paul Robeson, for Frederick Douglass, but even more important, she went with Mr. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, to Ghana. And when they had to leave there, when Nkrumah was no longer in power, she moved around, but she lived in Egypt. And the reason I'm telling you this story, and I should have been telling it for years, is that my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, and I were studying in Egypt. And Mrs. Du Bois heard that 2 American Negroes were studying at the American University, and she summoned us in the most gracious of way with this lovely invitation of the kind we had never seen before for tea. And we ended up spending 6 or 7 hours that day, and from then on, she became this amazing heroine to us. She was somebody who was so sophisticated. She spoke French, pas français, carrément, right? And this is what I want to leave you with. She said this. And this was in 1969, right after the death of Dr. King. She said, if there would be one wish for the American Negro. It would be that they would be taught to understand the important connection to their African brothers and sisters. That blacks in this country had not been taught to appreciate how we are out of that soil, of that blood, and that somehow, until we came to appreciate the significance of the African diaspora, we as a young group here could never be who we could possibly be. So as we listen to this scholar today, I don't want you just to think about W.E.B. Du Bois. I want you to think about that brilliant black woman who represents the best of our kind. This is at a time when the Nigerian population, by the way, in this country, if you don't know it, is the best educated of all those coming from all over the world. Give that group a round of applause. I want you to hear that. Literally 61%. If the country is at about 30, 61% of Nigerians over 25 in this country have graduated from college. So we can be inspired, for those of you from this country, by what we see from others. And remember this, there are 30 African countries represented at UMBC. More people from Sierra Leone than you know, more from Cameroon than you know. They're around. Look around and you will find them. Welcome this evening and welcome to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We will be performing for you the Jubilee Singers of the music department. I am Professor Janice Jackson. We will be singing a version of the Lift Every Voice by Roland Carter, arranged by Roland Carter. And we will be accompanied by a student, Ellington Carrington. And enjoy. We usually stand for this, but I'm going to give you a cue to stand. After we do the a cappella section, then we'll stand and you'll do the last verse with us, okay? Hopefully I'll remember. Out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last.
Thank you, Jubilee Singers, for that beautiful rendition. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Tamara Lewis, who graduated from UMBC in 1992 with a degree in psychology. She is an active alumna who has served in various capacities with the university, including member and vice president of UMBC's Alumni Association Board of Directors and founding member of the Chapter of Black and Latino Alumni, CBLA. Dr. Lewis is currently an education program specialist with the Maryland State Department of Education. As an alumna, Dr. Lewis recently leads efforts through CBLA and her sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Lambda Phi chapter, to give back to current students through the second generation scholarship. Please join me in welcoming her as she introduces 3 of our recipients this year. Dr. Lewis.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here this evening to introduce this year's scholarship recipients. I had the honor of sitting with 2 of them at dinner tonight, and they are outstanding students here. The Second Generation Scholarship was established in 1987 by a group of alumni and has provided financial assistance to numerous students since then. Students are selected based on level of their community service, their academic accomplishments, their commitment to the advancement of minorities, and their unique personal statements. This year, we are able to make 3 awards of $1,100 each. Our first recipient is Andrea Davis. Andrea is a senior majoring in sociology with a minor in Africana studies. She's participated in community service activities, including the Multiple Sclerosis Swim, and as a volunteer at the Baltimore Animal Rescue and Care Shelter, BARCS. She is also one of the Walter J. Sondheim Public Affairs Scholars, a program which focuses on giving students the tools to be an effective public servant. Andrea excels in academics and has made the President's List twice, as well as the Dean's List. She is an active student leader, and she serves on the Executive Council of Omicron Delta Kappa, the Leadership Honor Society. She is a senior orientation peer advisor, an executive aide to the Student Government Association president, a civic engagement and leadership intern, and is the current president of the Student Events Board. She's been recognized with the Student Affairs Leadership Award for her many contributions to UMBC. Please join me in congratulating Andrea Davis. We have a certificate to present to Andrea. Thank you so much. Our next award is for Richard Elliot. Is Richard present? No. Okay, you can. Okay. Richard is a senior with a double major in American Studies and Political Science and a minor in History. He has participated in student organizations such as being president of UMBC's Progressives, an organization established to politically inform and empower the UMBC community to become more socially conscious, culturally enlightened, and politically educated. He works hard to engage young people, particularly of color, and to get them more involved and active in Maryland politics. Richard is involved with the Council of Majors for both of his majors and has been on the President's List for high academic achievement. As a McNair Scholar, his research focused on examining the nexus between language, politics, and the way the boundaries of communities are socially constructed. In the past year, he presented his work at several conferences and is published in the UMBC Review, 2017 National Conference on Undergraduate Research Proceedings, and the European Journal of American Studies. One of Richard's professors describes him as an outstanding young man with exceptional intellectual curiosity, outstanding writing ability and analytical ability, and a strong, growing sense of professional responsibility. Please join me in congratulating Richard Elliot. Oh, sorry. You're definitely not. Thank you. Our next and final award goes to Jana Mitchell. Jana is a junior majoring in global studies with minors in Africana studies and biology. She is a student leader and is passionate about her involvement. Jana is a member of the Caribbean Students' Council, and during her sophomore year, served as community service chair, collaborating with the Red Cross to increase blood donations. She's also a member of the Global Brigade's environmental microfinance organization, where she participated in constructing sustainable agricultural projects for a community of farmers in Panama. She's a member of the Black Student Union and also held the role of vice president of the Africana Council, an organization that aims to be a resource for any student interested in the diaspora and Africana culture. Jana is also involved with research activities, and this past March was awarded third place in the 2017 Engineering Researchers National Conference in STEM. One of her professors described Jana as a budding young scholar and activist, and a serious student with sharp critical thinking skills. Another shared that Jana has what it takes to overcome any adversity and challenges that an undergraduate program at UMBC might pose to her. Please join me in congratulating Jana Mitchell. So we're very proud of these three students, and we're pleased to award them scholarships this year. Congratulations once again to the three of them.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome our Du Bois Distinguished Lecturer for this evening, Dr. Toyin Falola. Dr. Falola is Professor of History, the Jacob and Francis Sanger Moniker Chair in the Humanities, and University Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Falola is the author of 23 books, including The Humanities in Africa, Knowledge Production, Universities, and the Transformation of Society, The African Diaspora, Slavery, Modernity, and Globalization, Colonialism and Violence in Nigeria, The Historical Dictionary of Nigeria, Key Events in African History, a Reference Guide, Nationalism and African Intellectuals. Dr. Falola is also the co-author of 25 books, the editor of 24 books, and the co-editor of 88 books. And he's also the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters. He's also received many honors. Professor Falola is the recipient of 7 honorary doctoral degrees, including those from the University of Jos in Nigeria, Lincoln University, and the City University of New York, Staten Island. And he has received several dozens of lifetime awards, including the Distinguished Africanist Award, the Distinguished Africana Award, the Excellent Leadership Award, the Scholar Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Amistad Award for Academic Excellence in Historical Scholarship on Africa and the African Diaspora. Lastly, Professor Falola has also served as president of the African Studies Association and the Nigerian Studies Association, a member of the Scholars Council at the Library of Congress, and as vice president of UNESCO. He also has an international annual conference and a book award named after him. So please join me in welcoming our very distinguished lecturer for this evening, Dr. Toyin Falola.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here this evening. The very first time I'm on this campus. I've passed through the main road many times and I've seen the exits, and when I was taken inside, I was stunned, astonished. I never knew that there was such a hidden treasure here. Congratulations. And the students are very polite, which is very unusual in African campuses. And to the students here, I just want to plead that you use the enormous resources. I saw the Sherman Center, I went through some places, and these resources you have to convert to tremendous advantages. There can be no professor without students, because without you, nobody will be paid, and we hope that you will advance the project of this university. We pray that you become great and you are able to pay back and become generous so that this place will produce Nobel laureates, Amen. Pulitzer winners, and so many people. I cannot but thank the department, Wanda, all our great colleagues from the dean to faculty. They are all very nice. I had a wonderful discussion with the dean, and we had a wonderful meal. Your president is very impressive. Maybe we should make him the president of the country. And I thank the head of the African Department, Professor Chukwu, the big crowd, post-dinner or before dinner. I appreciate you all for coming here, and I hope I don't disappoint you. And if I do, I hope you will know to go and drink beer. The Department of Music, thank you very much. I was in the choir for 11 years, and I once sang that very same song. Thank you very much for that wonderful opportunity. To the 3 recipients of the scholarship today, the second generation scholars, you know they're setting you up. It's a setup. They want you to become greater. They want you to become greater. So this is just the foundation of greatness. And may you receive additional scholarships and awards, and may your future be greater than those who have given you the award. You say amen. 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 Well, when I was invited, I originally actually wanted to talk about Du Bois, the great man, and hopefully I will have an opportunity to come back for a seminar and talk about him, because I've also done work on Du Bois in Ghana. But for those of you who may not know him, I just want to mention 2 aspects that people do not talk about. And these 2 aspects are revolutionary. And they are grounded in the belief that he was one of the most preeminent intellectuals of the last century, of all races, any races, no question. And what he did that was revolutionary is that he was the first to frame the notion of Africa that we have adopted today. So when you see books on Africa, and some of you brought my books for me to sign, when we teach African history, African studies, we all hold Du Bois for that framing. What do we mean? It is not Africans themselves who named Africa. It is not Africans who woke up and said, we want to become Africa. There was the European labeling, Leo Frobenius, Africanus, and then the Bilad al-Sudan, in which the Arabs label Africa, cutting off North Africa away from it. It was Du Bois preeminently who fused North Africa with the rest of Africa and stamped it with the label of Africa. The very first notion that we have come to adopt. It was a struggle, but bear in mind, you are so close to DC, I've participated in State Department. Washington, DC does not use Du Bois' framing of Africa. What do? What they do is to first of all remove Egypt from Africa. It has relocated. They lump it to Middle East. And if you look at program in American universities, it is North Africa and the Middle East. And they disconnect North Africa from the rest of Africa. So what is now left in Africa is to return to the pre-Du Bois framing of Africa. And they use the code Sub-Saharan Africa. That code means blackness. In other words, the very fight that Du Bois struggled to do, we continue to say it is not so. It is not so. When we put the 5 volumes of African history together, it was one of the very first time in introducing these books to college students that we went back to put North Africa back into it. For many of you who do African history, it's very, very rare, unless your professors are conscious of it, for them to include North Africa into it. And each time we do this, we dishonor the legacy and the memory of this great scholar. In Africa and the World, one of the best books ever written, he was the very first to frame the insertion of Africa into world history, and together with some people before him to begin to characterize the legacy in terms of civilization, contributions, and he was able to energize a new generation of thinkers to adopt a larger framework, a Pan-Africanist framework. Unfortunately, that dream collapsed. He moved to Ghana. By 1963 that he died, 2 theoreticians were prophetic, Fanon and Du Bois. Fanon was able to anticipate that the way Africans were doing ethnicity, the way they were doing identity, Fanon warned them that we are going to get into trouble. Fanon said, do a nationalist consciousness that is bigger, the way Du Bois was framing it. If they had followed that approach, the history of the continent would have been very different, extremely different. Fanon saw, like Du Bois, the rising generation of new African leaders. The Pan-Africanist dream of Du Bois' vision was sabotaged by the very leadership that he participated in creating, such that when somebody like me began to say, Africa needs to have a university named after him, there's no university named after Du Bois, is a big betrayer. And this betrayer, we hope that another generation will correct. We thank you, Du Bois, and we thank the university for accepting the name of Du Bois to name this lecture. Thank you very much. I come to this lecture from various dimensions. And like all lectures and projects, there's always a history to it. And this history will flesh out in various dimensions. First dimension, when the United States got rid of Boutros Ghali, many of you are too young to remember him, Secretary General of United Nations, an Egyptian. He served 1 term, but he got into trouble in terms of his politics on the Middle East, politics in the White House. They got rid of him. So he got tired and got bored And he was looking for a project to occupy his time. And he sold the idea to UNESCO. Why don't we create an AfroArab Summit? Why don't we create an AfroArab Summit? And this AfroArab Summit will be dealing with the issues of migrations. It was accepted. Mubarak accepted it, appointed his wife as a patron, and we set up a commission, and I became a member, and we meet in Cairo every year. To discuss what? To make the argument that if you look at the area around Egypt, the Palestinian, 2 million people move. They move. Where to? Sometimes they move to oil-rich Arab countries. Many Palestinians will move to Libya, where they became domestics. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is that it is not true by the time this AfroArab Summit was set up that many Africans were actually moving to the West. That is not correct. Many Africans were actually moving within Africa. Moving westward to Ghana, to Gambia. By the 1990s, Nigerian immigrants, Nigerian ties had displaced 2 countries, becoming the second preeminent trading partner of Ghana. After 1994, when apartheid collapsed, many people began to move to South Africa, always resembling the Bantu movement that populated that part of Southern Africa. Many people from Zimbabwe began to move, and we began to say, how best can we benefit from this internal movement? Because people like Du Bois have been praying for that moment, only that the way they were praying for it was to build continental unity and to facilitate the argument that there is no point for Africa to have 52, 53 countries. Bear in mind, this argument had been there in the 19th century. A young man living in New York by the name of Marcus Garvey had suggested the creation of one country, United States of Africa. In fact, he drew up a constitution and made himself the president of Africa. He came up with a uniform, there was a constitution. And in the spirit of Du Bois, they did not like those boundaries. So we were very happy about all these various immigration. And then forces began to come to propel the broadening of these movements. The broadening of these movements, which acquired force in the 1980s, I have a lecture, but I don't like to read. I like to talk from my head, began to produce new consequences. That Africans now began to move in the 1980s. And they began to move not just within Africa, and they continue to do that, but they now began to move globally. In moving globally, the forces that created that movement was not taken in Africa. The forces that created the contemporary African diaspora in large numbers was created in Washington, D.C. by Bretton Woods institution. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Paris Club, and lenders. What did they do? In the 70s, when a country like Nigeria had substantial foreign reserve, they said, come and take a loan. They went to so many countries, Latin America, Africa, and said, come and take a loan. That you can use this loan to facilitate your development project. Many people took loan, and then they began to ask them to pay back by the 80s and 90s. When they were asking them to pay back, the interest for some of these countries became bigger than their national revenues. It became bigger. They could not pay back. And as they could not pay back, the banks advised the Bretton Woods institution that they should create what was called a structural adjustment program. That structural adjustment program became one of the worst economic calamities of the last century. And it set the foundation of this global migration, not just in Africa, in Latin America and the Caribbean. That as economic forces devastated them, as their economies declined, they now began to make arguments. Devalue your currency. They said, devalue your currency. They did that. When I came to this country for the first time, sponsored by Operation Crossroads Africa, 1 naira was stronger than $1. Today, $1 is 363 naira. So they said, do you need universities? Commercialize the universities. And as the exchange rate collapsed, expatriate scholars began to leave, books became difficult to get, jobs became difficult. My salary by the 80s, by the time I bought a tire for my Volkswagen, there will be nothing left. Those economies were devastated. Africans did not do that which is unusual in world history. That when you devastate economies, what will people do? They begin with internal options. The men will take to crime, the women will take to prostitution. And as they expand those options and those expansion began to close, they begin to look for spots in the world where they can carry those things to. If host society is open to them, they use their skills professionally. If the host societies don't open to them, they do that which they know best. And by the 1990s, you begin to have enormous migrations of Africans in various places, within, without, and propelled by these declining economies that forced many people to leave. And I will provide the figures momentarily. And as people begin to leave, more and more begin to leave, and others join them. So that by the time we enter the new millennium, you begin to find a large numbers of Africans had moved, with figures approaching, when you cumulate them, to those who are forced by the Atlantic slave trade. So that the numbers of Africans that moved from the 80s to now, internally, outside, assumed a staggering figure of over 10 million. That's more than a country that moved. But in that movement, professionals also moved. By 2010, 2015, 50% of doctors trained in Ghana had left Ghana. When we break these things down into discipline, which I can do, but no time, take literature. Achebe left, Shoyinka left, Ngugi left, Nurudi Farai left. So preeminent intellectuals left. By 1988, a person like me also joined, and others left. Then now came a different set. 70s, 60s, if you send someone from Kenya, Nigeria, to go and get a PhD in the University of London or Columbia, that person will defend on Monday. By Tuesday, you won't find him. Where is he? He will be back in Africa. He'll be back in Africa. There was no point. The jobs were good. Actually, the jobs were better than in the West because it came with a very nice house. You're going to have a domestic help. You may end up with a driver. You are going to be promoted very quickly. You are going to do well. And as these economies were devastated, we began to have clusters of population to the extent that today there is no place you are not going to find Africans. And there's no place from Iceland, Alaska, people coming from hot temperature, able to live in Alaska. You know that is something else. Now, as we now find them in these various places, the best way to now understand it is to say that that which we call the African diaspora, in the literature, it is homogenized. It is characterized in the same way, sometimes with variations. But in doing that, a number of mistakes have been made. And let me quickly correct that mistake as part of that lecture. You can identify 3 waves in this movement of blacks. The first one, which has given name to departments, to identity, the enforced migration associated with slavery from the early modern economy to the 19th century, producing the great African American population, producing a great identity. For those of us who study American history, the trajectory of this country was actually to become a dominantly black population. The forces that made it otherwise is a subject for another day. That identity is very well known. It made substantial contributions to this society in terms of building the foundation of this economy, in terms of expanding capitalism, in terms of infusing it with creative elements from blue music to jazz, to limitless creativity, even up until today in rap music, in gangster music, in everything you can mention. That contribution is very solid, even if it is unrecognized. We study that in Black Studies program and in the representation. But as we study that, we tend to erase a second wave. We have not been writing about that second wave. We call it the wave of colonization. And I will start that the first wave, you can say Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson and the ancestors and things like that. In the second wave of colonization, you would think there is a first wave that will produce the first black president. That was not the wave that produced the president. The wave that produced the second president, Barack Obama, was not the diaspora of slavery. It was the diaspora of colonization. And people tend to miss that point. During the campaign against Mrs. Hillary Clinton, remember, she was trying to smuggle into the conversation how black was Barack Obama. It was a very clever device. And how black was he was not about his biracialism. It is about that connection to the diaspora of slavery. What happened is a phenomenon that has also not been studied. After 1885, European powers colonized Africa, partitioned it into various countries. As they governed the continent, creating monocrop economies, foundations of a fraudulent colonial modernity, foundation of a disastrous political modernity, foundation of a fraudulent educational system, Africans began to understand them. And in trying to understand them, they were looking for avenues of escape. Where would they go to? In looking for avenues of escape, in relation to higher education, the greatest opportunity came from the United States of America. And within the United States of America, the greatest opportunity came from historically black colleges. We have not been grateful enough to them. Some of us have been saying that African countries should pay back. Fisk, Livingstone, Tuskegee, Lincoln, they contributed, Howard, the Mecca. They call it the Mecca. They contributed tremendously to fulfilling the desire that European governments denied Africans. And I can give you 3 examples. Banda, president. Azikiwe went to Lincoln, and from there, as a young man, became persuaded by Padmore and Du Bois, developed strong notions of Pan-Africanism, became the first president of Ghana. Azikiwe went to Lincoln, became one of the best theoreticians of liberation, wrote many books, became a preeminent journalist, became the first president of Nigeria. We cannot thank these historically black colleges enough. And when Lincoln gave me an honorary doctorate, part of what I said is, it is not just the United States that should empower those universities. African governments hold them a responsibility. Do they have the resources? Yes, they do. But do they have the political correctness? No, they don't. And you and I have to plead that this kind of political correctness of paying back must be done. But it is in that wave that this Kenyan came to the US, who became Obama's father. That wave of colonization, why you did not notice it is because when African countries became independent, opportunities opened up tremendously in Africa, and they went back to Africa. They went back. And then as African countries established their own universities, as opportunities opened up, there was no need for that expansion to come. But other forces began to retain this connection. 1957, Sputnik, civil rights, the rise of Malcolm X, the Cold War, all this began to pressure US government to say that they needed to have the knowledge about Africa. They began to encourage, starting at first, American campuses to create Africa program. Black radicalism of the civil rights called for the establishment of Black Studies program. You know, many people lost their lives in that process, violence on campuses. And as that spaces opened up, African students began to come, but even those people began to go back home. The wave that came that did not go back home are the waves created by the Bretton Woods institutions. The wave of myself, the wave of the people that we now produce who don't go back home, and that is the wave that I'm studying now. And in studying this wave, I have to say that the data, we're just trying to accumulate the data. We're trying to accumulate the data because it is just imagine, and a professor on this campus who is here this evening has added to the literature by writing about the Igbo diaspora. In doing this wave, in studying this wave, it is so new that many of what we know are grounded in opinions. And it is my study, a few other studies that are saying we cannot study millions of people through opinions, and that we have to begin to look for concrete data. What concrete data do we have now? We have the data by the federal government, the census is good, but it's not reliable because you already know, not just African immigrants. Immigrants in general don't want to have anything to do with customs, with immigration, with police, with Internal Revenue Service. So any figures that those agencies give you, they are always very limited. You cannot be an immigrant in Houston and you see people coming to your house to count the census. You are going to run away from the backyard. Then we have samples that we collect in several places, like university campus. The president was saying there's a number of people from various countries on university campuses. That data is very good. I'm going to get into trouble by offending the president. Universities engage in triple counting because of the way they do their statistics. When it favors universities, they characterize everybody as international students. When it favors them, they look for blackness, they count all of them. When it favors them, they disaggregate that blackness and locate them in different countries. So when we study data from campuses, we always also have to ask many questions. But those questions are further complicated by how the students themselves count themselves. Because they do triple counting, they do double counting. I hold 3 passports. When you ask me, it is you, the person that is asking me, that shapes the answer that I give. One day I'm a Nigerian, the next day I'm an African, the third time when I do work for UNESCO or United Nations, I'm a diplomat. So it is, immigrants count themselves that way. An American citizen can tell you he's a Nigerian. In Nigeria, they don't know that he's a Nigerian. In America, because of scholarship, student loan, job opportunities, he's no longer a Nigerian. He becomes an American. So we have a lot of double counting. And it's a complication for this kind of research. It's so complicated that all the figures, we question them, and collecting them is so difficult. So what did I do? What I did is, spending a lot of money, I began to do what is called snowballing. Snowballing is a form of research. It's difficult to test it with a baseline. We don't do it with a baseline. We just say, okay, I can snowball all of you with a question. Do you like rice? I can snowball this room. And then I can say, there are 2,000 people here, 500 of you like rice, I work at percentages. That's what we call snowballing. So I began to do very time-consuming, expensive snowballing research. Houston, Dallas, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Chicago, Minnesota. And I've amassed enormous amount of data that others have to use for me because I may not have the long life to use all the data. And in doing this, part of what we are trying to do is to say that we now have an opportunity, and a university like yours can do that, to create a new subfield. It's a very complicated argument that we study immigration, yes. In studying immigration, the larger literature is dominated not by this wave that I'm studying. That we now have the opportunity to create what we call a new African diaspora. Contemporary African immigrants, and begin to teach it. And until we begin to teach it, until we begin to map it out in the academy, we are not going to be able to keep expanding the field. And part of what I'm doing with this research is that we should convert it into a subfield of its own and begin to create specializations in it, begin to award PhDs in it, and begin to tell department as yours to begin to mount courses in it, so that we have a new generation of students and scholars who will advance this study forward and connect it to the older African diaspora, connect it to immigration studies, and begin to look for possibilities that it can arise. Second, that we can begin to do what we have done in the African Union. The African Union has redefined Africa itself. In the textbooks, including the one that I wrote, we break down Africa into North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Southern Africa. The African Union has said it is now going to have a sixth region. It is now formalized. It's now in the African Union document, which will be the African diaspora. They are returning back to the idea of Du Bois that we should not separate Africans in Africa from Africans outside of Africa. That we should merge it, create what is called a sixth region. And in that sixth region, we return to the other arguments that people have made over and over again, that in developing Africa, we have to tap into the talents of people outside of Africa. Have other people done it? Yes. And the preeminent example that people cite over and over again is the state of Israel. And in recognizing that those of us who are here constitute the sixth region, we begin to rethink African development. Now we've created, say in a country like Nigeria, the African Diaspora Fund. We are pressuring African governments, and Ghana, for instance, is mapping out how to do it, that people here should be able to vote. We have people saying that what is wrong with somebody leaving this college who is from Kenya to have the ambition that he wants to become the president of Kenya. We are now making that argument that the education that you receive here should be able to be part of the development challenge that will move us forward. So the methodology for this study, as I've hinted, is complicated, and until we begin to, first of all, we have to create methodologies that will acquire respect. We have to create the protocols that will acquire respect. We are doing that now, and we have to begin to validate it. Validation is a very difficult process. For those of you who are old enough, you will see how in the 60s and 70s, the validation of black scholarship was very difficult. You see the challenges that people like Molefi Ashanti faced, the attack on black journals, that they are not scholarship, the use of so-called objective criteria to degrade scholarship. So we have to validate the scholarship, and we cannot validate it until we take it seriously, work out a methodology to study it, work out its protocol, and begin to validate it. And I've started to say, this is how to do it, and I've been mounting seminars on how to do it. As to whether this can be justified, you justify a subfield in various ways. Significance, which is very easy to establish. The number is there to establish it. The number of African intellectuals, African scholars, African professionals is so high that there is hardly a university, any major university in the West, that you are not going to find an African. And there's a lot of mobility, there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of fluidity in this process. And in mapping out some of the research that I've started to do, we have been collecting ideas about self-identification. We have been saying, how do we know children who are born in Africa, children are born in the US, what do they call themselves? And we have been mapping out in 10 cities how to do a process of self-identification, how to work out a methodology that will let us arrive at issues of self-identification, how to do double counting, how to do hybridity, multiple identities, and things like that, and the complication of doing all this. When we combine all these statistics, the ones provided by the American census, sample data, and a number of things, we begin to map out a variety of characteristics, but we still face one big dilemma, which is different from that of double counting. It is very difficult in any country to know the number of undocumented immigrants. In the last campaign, some people put it at 20 million. It's an estimate. We can never know. It is so difficult, so complicated, that will always skew the number. But when we combine all this, the number in 2012 for Africa that we can count, 1, 2, 3, 4, was 1.6 million, which began to increase. And we now know where people came from, that in 1960, US Census put African figures at 35,000, the ones they could count, students, those who came for jobs. 1970, the ones they could count, 80,000, 207, 1.4 million. And in the 1970s and 80s, the number exploded. And why did it explode? It exploded for the following reasons. Africans began to realize that going to Europe was problematic. People from French-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, who used to go to Europe began to come to the US. So if you go to New York today, you're going to find so many Senegalese who will have gone to Europe in previous years. Second, you have the rising number of refugees in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, you had people from Liberia, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan who joined. Cumulatively, what we now realize by last year is that the population of Africans double every 10 years. And that by 2022, a minimum of over 3 million people will be from Africa. That's official. We do not know the ones that we cannot count. Not only do we know that, we know where people come from, that the greater percentage come from Western Africa, followed by Eastern Africa, 17% from Northern Africa, and Southern Africa, 5%. And we know the largest born populations are from Nigeria, from Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Egypt, South Africa. Of these 7, the 4 largest were Nigerians. We know their numbers. But we are also fortunate, we know the clusters. And by clusters, we know where they concentrate. And if you ask me questions, we can explain. This concentration, Maryland, D.C., Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, California, and Texas, and the cities of choice, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, New York, Atlanta. All these are the highly urbanized places. And as the president told you, we are also able to track using sensors, sample data, a number of characteristics. And in tracking one of those characteristics, we are able to know issues around education, issues around occupation, and issues around some other dimensions. Foreign-born population, second generation, established population, they have always been problematic in immigrant population studies. And some of these we have to map out more carefully to leave areas of opinion. So new studies have been emerging in terms of how a few scholars are studying this representation. We are beginning to have professional associations. We now can approach the African Medical Association, Nigerian Pharmacy Associations. We now have insertion into the academy. We can now approach this subject from churches. As churches are segregated, you can now study African churches as a community, like Redeemer's Church of Christ, which we know dominantly are populated by immigrants, and we're beginning to also have studies in that direction. And we are also beginning to have specific studies in terms of traders, in terms of restaurants, in terms of specific occupations like nursing. And as we're able to accumulate all those, we will be able to answer more questions, construct new ideas, understand diaspora mobilities, and understand issues of labor. In this, as this field develops, we are beginning to accumulate data in 10 areas. And in these 10 areas, we have issues around migrations. We are beginning to understand adjustments to host societies and the politics of insertion. It is very, very difficult to understand the politics of insertion because it is difficult to tease out the evidence. We are able to identify a small category of exiles. We are able to compile a list of ethnic and national associations where the government forces them to register because they are raising money. We are able now to understand specific immigrant religion. We know there are now African witches in the US because the notions of witchcraft are spread here. We are able to identify the variant of African immigrant Islam as they disconnect themselves from Pakistani Islam. And we are able to also begin to understand clusters of indigenous religion. These clusters of indigenous religions had been there in African American community. Remember, New Orleans, Voodoo. Remember, Miami, Santeria. Remember, South Carolina, Oyotunji Village. So these clusters had emerged. And we are very, very fortunate that Africans are sending diviners and indigenous priests. We have been, I know the Babalawo in DC. I've interviewed them. We are able to, my former vice chancellor, when I was at the University of Ife, by the name of Wande Abimbola, has his own divination school in Atlanta. As we map out all these divination schools, somebody can now do a PhD on African immigrant diviners in the US. For those of you who are looking for choices about women to marry, men to marry, I can make recommendations to you, to diviners that will give you the best advice. We now begin to have occupations. You now can do a PhD on African scholars in American universities. We can do that. We can do African cultural spaces. We can do them in terms of consumption, in terms of symbolism, but more so in terms of how they cluster in Atlanta, in Houston, Bisonet is all African stores. And we are now able to map where people live. Houston, Dallas, we now map out what we call Little Lagos. That's what we call them. They're Little Lagos, in which all Nigerians live in the same neighborhood. And as they do that, it facilitates our studies. And we are now able, thanks to the internet, to understand internet nations. These are very aggressive, very dynamic, and those internet nations, they've enabled us to create a large intellectual industry. I set up one, and there are members here, which is called US-Africa Dialogue, comprising African intellectuals, serious intellectual debates, serious arguments, a lot of fight, and 2 books have been written on the site that I established. And in establishing it, I have over 10,000 subscribers, and if you post something, it reaches over 1 million people. That is enormous amount of data that is helping us. Then we have issues around cultural brokerage and couriers. In this cultural brokerage and couriers, a new set of arguments have arisen. What do we call these people? It has been a struggle to label them. And here I'm going to get into trouble. In the 50s and 60s, this problem arose, and some people in the literature label them as black. But here is a problematic, and I alluded to it earlier on. In Nigeria, nobody will call me an African. Why would you call me an African? What would be your reason? That's not a label. You use an ethnic label. You can say, he's an Igbo person. And in Nigeria, unless I go to Ghana or Sierra Leone, it is only when people are fighting sometimes that they will call you a Nigerian. They use a label. The first time they call me an African was in England. And I look at myself. I couldn't even quickly process it. Because nobody will call me an African in Lagos. It's only in South Africa that people will call you an African, which is a code to me, you are black. So we now begin to say, what do we label this? The problem is how identities form. Ali Mazrui suggested we begin to call them American Africans instead of African Americans. And on some campuses, you are going to see students wearing shirts, T-shirt, Nigerian American. So that's one problematic, that the label, we still do not know this issue of label, arising from how new identities have been formed. That's one complication. The other complication we interrogate the issues of the homeland. Remember the Back to Africa movement, the big arguments between Frederick Douglass and Delany about whether African Americans should go back to Africa, especially with the failure of the Reconstruction following the American Civil War. And Frederick Douglass, using his intellectual power, made the arguments that African Americans are citizens, they should not go back to Africa. He won the argument. Delany wrote his book, which I republished, reintroduced, saying African Americans should go back. Some did go. American Colonization Society encouraged the going and things like that. Subsequently, over time, that argument was resolved. In the case of contemporary African immigrants, the debates that African Americans had in the 1860s, they are just having it now. Where should you retire to? If you die, where should you be buried? When they do that, we are searching for the appropriate label to use. And the label that people use is to call them transnationalists. Transnationalists. Transnationalism is a concept of an ambiguous homeland. This year alone, I've been to Nigeria 7 times. I am leaving for Nigeria December 1st to give a convocation lecture. I'm going back first week in January. I'm going back last week in January. If you do that, the question now becomes, how do we define you and what is your home? In a concept of transnationalism, when you have multiple homes and when you double count homes, they are so difficult for us in terms of studying identity and in terms of how to understand your statements. When you make them, it complicates this research because sometimes what you tell us will depend on when you wake up. That complication is there. And there is another complication which has cost a lot of money. In immigration studies, it has a template. Why did you leave your country? They would mention politics. That template is standard. Why do you leave your country? Economics. That template is standard. When we did snowballing sample, we were surprised that 3% in our pool did not conform to anything in immigration studies. They did not leave Africa because they are poor. They did not leave Africa because they are exiles. And as we begin to open up this conversation, the entire basis of immigration studies collapsed. It collapsed. Immigration studies always assume that it is poor people who travel. It's an opinion that has no validity in data. When we begin to map out the African dimension of this topic, it is actually people with income who travel. And then we went back to Central Africa, we went back to West Africa to realize that the students who are here, who are my campus, are not what we find, what the data you find in immigration studies, that leaving their countries is induced by poverty. Some of them are induced because they have resources to travel. So we have that problematic, and we still do not know how to fully analyze it, because it goes against the literature on the ground. That if you see Nigerians, they are poor people. And I went back to this great theoretician, a sociologist, French sociologist, who studied habitus. It's a very fascinating argument, and I'm testing it, in which he begins to link behavior to clusters in the population by occupations, by ethnicity, by wealth, and how they act out their behavior. And Peter made the argument that once you form that cluster in relation to habitus, values begin to form in ways in which it shapes human behavior. And I'm beginning to test that as the African elite try to reproduce themselves, that part of that reproduction fits into migration. That is not what immigration studies tell us. What immigration studies do is to map out poverty, and link poverty to immigration. What we are now doing is to map out wealth and link it to immigration. There is no poor person, a student of a poor person, who can be a student on my campus. It is $22,000. No scholarship. That is not poverty. Where did you get the $22,000 from? And as we became shocked, this opened up a new field of research for us. Then we became shocked again. We began to analyze in 3 cities home ownership. I analyzed home ownership in Dallas, in Houston, and I did another study in Atlanta over a 3-month period. And as we analyzed home ownership from the data supplied to us, we edit out of that data Africans who bought houses with income made from the United States. And as we went to Sugarland, specifically, using data, we began to realize that more than 3% bought houses not making any money from the US. They didn't make their money here. Where did they make the money from? The money from Africa. And we flew to Portugal, where the percentage became higher, in which over 11% of Africans with houses in Portugal did not make a single cent from Portugal. The money came from Angola. And the subset of richest Portuguese now are Angolan citizens. They are from Africa. And as we begin to accumulate this data, we reach an average of 3% Africans who are not driven by political circumstances. They are not driven by poverty. They are actually driven by the fact that they are good in any currency. And that opens up another avenue of research, that when we locate Africa in development, we call it a third world. And what that third world does is to homogenize poverty, forgetting that there's a substantial first world in Africa, so rich that it's unbelievable. 2 examples: Lagos, real estate; Victoria Island, Lekki. There is no American professor who can buy a house in Lekki, maybe Henry Louis Gate. I'm not talking about a house. I'm just talking about land in which an imagined elite has a lot of money. African cities, a number of major African cities are becoming the most expensive cities in the world. Very expensive. And as they accumulate this money from a variety of sources, they began not only to spend this money within Africa, we now are able to track them into real estate. And as we track them, they begin to rupture many of what we assume in immigration studies. And as they rupture this, we have to begin to rethink the reasons for immigration. That while we are not discounting poverty, we have to now begin to look for data to broaden our understanding. Some issues I have to skip because of time. I don't want them to stop me from talking as I'm enjoying myself. And then we're beginning to talk about issues of survival and incorporation We know that they are highly educated, and we are beginning to pose a question about success. What do they mean by success, and how some of the data begin to shock us? Some of these data are beginning to shock us. Remember, the president praising Nigerians. And remember official statistics. Some samples have been conducted in this city that Africans do well. No question. But there is a disconnect between that education and that occupation. There's a big disconnect in which the degrees do not correlate to occupations. And as we begin to do specific studies, 61% of disconnect. What do we mean by that? That there's a disconnect as high as over 50% of people who have that education who cannot use it. Either they have a BA from one campus and they are cab drivers, or they have a BS in chemistry and they work in hospital. So that you now begin to see factory workers, nurses, cab drivers, people in hair salons, storekeeping, who have degrees, but those degrees are not necessarily connected to what they do. And as we confront this data, we begin to ask questions about issues around satisfaction, issues around jobs, issues around emotions, and we begin again to be shocked that people began to complain in terms of saying that they have not been very happy, that there are problems with their success, and that they are having issues around values. And we have also been studying relationship between Africans and African Americans with staggering conclusions, and we have been studying issues around those who want to go back home, race relations, engagement with the home. And as we do this data, we begin to expand the notion of that Du Bois raised, issues around double consciousness. We begin to interrogate it, and we begin to find new conclusions that question the price of migration. Look at that data there from the snowballing sample. It is frightening that 43% in the Houston survey say that coming to America has been a big mistake. That is very high. There's no way, if you don't do that snowballing sample, that you are going to say that. 43% is too high, because the impression that we get and the impression that the whole societies communicate is that things are good, things are working well, and that things are problematic for them. And as we open this data, we begin to study issues around, do they want to go back home? How do we measure the impact? And we're talking about, I'm sorry that I have to do all this. And I want to close by issues around return journey, in which we're also shocked. In this return journey, we map out, we're now conducting studies. Those who actually went back to Africa, we track them, and we are beginning to track those who come back. And as we track those who come back, and as we try to understand the processes, we're beginning to also realize that a number that go back also come back. And when we throw gender into it, we begin to get a surprise that many African women, more than men, say that they don't want to go back. And this opens up a new research that we are trying to explore. Let me close by saying that a new field is about to emerge, of which many of you will contribute to. And this field will become part of Black Studies. It will solidify, contribute to older studies. It will facilitate the understanding of African American identity. It will restore our understanding of Pan-Africanism, but it will also create its own new clusters that will allow us to understand transnationalism. It will allow us to understand a new generation of Africans. It will allow us to understand issues around transnationalism, issues around remittances, but more fundamentally, as we accumulate this data, those of us who are interested in the development of Africa will begin to stand on solid ground to make a case for how we can create a bigger link between the United States and Africa and generate an overall economic impact. Thank you very much. I stayed too long. Yeah.
Let me ask a question. Those who are still here. We see that a disproportionately large number of the highest achieving blacks in America come from other countries.
Yes. Yes.
You don't know it by mentioning the president of Howard, who's provost, who's a UMBC graduate, who's from one of the African countries. His chief operating officer, all from other countries. The president of Zambia is from another country, and I can go on and on. And it adds considerably to the talent in our country. The challenge is this. You look at the Ivies, as you know, the most socially prestigious places, disproportionately the blacks who are there, even as the numbers have gone down, are from other countries. And even if they're not from another country, they're out in New York and their parents, right? And we should be inspired by that. But here's the challenge. This is a campus that has worked really hard to bring in people from other countries, but to also remember that this country has a certain responsibility to blacks who have forebears who were slaves in this country. And there's a need for balance. The ineluctable question is, how do we work to help both groups, to support and empower both groups, and to help ensure that we don't begin to have growing tension between the groups as we see one group doing so much better. I just read the statistic. 3/4 of the Nigerian children in this country, 3/4 of the fathers of Nigerian in this country have college degrees.
Yes.
50% of the mothers, but 60%, 3/4.
Yeah.
You know that means so much for the future of those children. So what would you suggest we can do as we work to build relationships between the groups, rather than more of the situation of haters?
Yes. And I'm very grateful to that question. And more than 50% are still here,
Yes.
which makes me very happy. And for those of you who have not been following this conversation, I want to add another element to what the president has said, which is that we should tackle this issue not to damage interracial relations, not to produce a set of black-on-black violence, which we saw in South Africa and in other places. And for those of you who have been following this, you remember at Harvard, it became an issue, and people said the blacks that Harvard are claiming are not African Americans, but they are Africans and people from Caribbean. And you remember when I mentioned issues of double counting, that universities also contribute to this. Cornell, this became an issue for those of you who follow this topic, in which black students at Cornell wrote to the university that the people that Cornells are admitting, calling blacks, are Nigerians and Ghanaians, and they are not African Americans. The data supports that. So, I came from an older Pan-Africanist orientation. That is how I was trained. That is what I believe. I am a member of the Pan-Africanist school of the 40s and 50s with a strong commitment to it. So here is the problem. And until we solve this problem, the bigger problem that the president raised cannot be solved. These current immigrants that I'm studying are beneficiaries of the struggles of the civil rights movement, but they do not understand that history. You understand? They did not contribute to that struggle. You understand? By the time they came, democratic spaces had expanded for them. Schools have been created for them. The benefits of the struggles by Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and others are already there for them to enjoy. Very good. The damage is that they don't understand the notion of race, and they don't understand the notion of that history. And during the annual Martin Luther King March, you have to physically carry them before they will participate. We have a lot of work to do. And that work is to say that that which you enjoy, universities like this that you come, they are products of struggle. Even if you did not participate in that struggle, it does not mean you should not understand it. And until they understand it, we'll be in a bigger trouble. And that trouble, which will get me into trouble with some of my colleagues, is that that success in gaining admission and things like that, they misread it. They misread it in ways in which superstructure has created the narrative. Superstructures always say that poor people are poor because they are lazy. You understand? That's the way superstructure creates the narrative. And contemporary immigrants can buy into that. But what they miss, to go back to the concept of habitus, is that immigrants who come to the US come with tremendous cultural capital. They come with tremendous cultural capital. They have a notion of pride, which has not been damaged. They understand ethnicity, which is Yoruba and Igbo fighting, which is different from race and racism. And they are products of reproduction. They are embedded in projects of mobility. You understand? And that cultural capital, people have to understand it, that it makes a substantial difference from being born into a project house in Chicago. They have to understand that. It's a substantial difference. Issues of values, issues of how you've managed capitalism, issues of transference. I tell people, it is misleading to characterize a person like me in terms of the template of blackness. They've been going to school in my family since the 19th century. My father was enormously wealthy. So, indeed, of the 9 children of my father, 2 of them are born, I am the poorest, and I'm making a 6-figure salary. You understand? So, I was able, from the 19th century, to produce 3 successful kids, 2 of whom are millionaires today. You understand? Change the history, change the narrative in which I'm from Project House, right? And I carry that forward is difficult. So that aspect, people like myself and our colleagues, we have a lot of re-education of our colleagues and of Africans. Going back to the idea of the miseducation of the Negro, that we have to provide this concrete education. We have that one to do.
And also, I have to say, it's not just from the projects of Chicago, and I've studied it so carefully. It's even from middle-class Prince George's County or Birmingham. Not that there are some advantages, perhaps, but the cultural capital is not there.
Yes.
It's that insistence of
yes.
And it is something that very few people understand. I appreciate what you say.
We have to write about it and say, look, these Africans, you also need a different set of education. How we are going to do that is something that my colleagues and I have to talk about, but it has to be done. Second, when we go to the dimension, so that's one side, we have to begin to say that what is it that we owe people in terms of understanding that structure, how we can begin to call that structure into question. The climate today is not good in terms of the White House, but it is a project that has to be done. But because if we don't do it, ultimately, all of us are going to be set back. And we don't want to wait for a situation in which universities have to begin to respond to political pressure to take measures to do this. I appreciate the question a lot, and I just pray that this does not become a major political issue. Yeah. Yes?
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't. Just a brief introduction. I work for Harvard and Boyd, Randolph, and so many other people out of the civil rights movement had pushed for the Faulkner movement, solidarity economics. And there's a movement here in the country of the United States that's never really stopped. Kind of slavery and money, mutual aid societies in the present times. But the history has been squashed. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the word but Courage talks about solidarity economics and the movements here. Now I was wondering if you have your hand.
Well, so here is the bigger context. There is no question that is very simple because they're always embedded in bigger context. Bear in mind that projects like the cooperative, similar ones, arose out of seeking solutions to empowerment. They are liberationist projects. That's essentially what gave back to them. And bear in mind After the Second World War, the rise of the Fabian Party, gestures towards communism, attempts towards socialism, McCarthyism, and things like that, they created a different kind of thinking that produced that kind of approach. As in the bigger projects of the left, socialism, cooperative, liberation struggles, anti-apartheid struggles, they are all in a moment of decline. So what we have as we speak today is the seduction of the market. Seduction of the market. In that seduction of the market, forces of collective solidarity are being submerged into forces of consumption. And as that seduction of consumption, a popular market overtake you and I, they change the dynamics of operations. Cooperative, networking, solidarity. Even if you say any statement that gestures towards combativeness, you may get into trouble. So, how do we rethink this? One suggestion is to go back to older ideas of grassroots mobilization. Societies operate on the basis of a covenant. By covenant is an unwritten rule. What is it that you and I agree to in terms of how we want to move society forward, the changes we want to do? That covenant in some societies can even be based on the Bible. Or sometimes, as in the case of Africa, based on the notion of Ubuntu, communitarianism, communalism, and things like that. Africans created kinship just to protect the weaker member of society so that the stronger member can distribute resources and elevate other people. Now, if you go back to when, I do not know when you were in school. When I was in school, in college, what they were doing was to say, collect a degree so that you can send other people to school. When Achebe wrote his trilogy, which it connects beautifully, my favorite is The Arrow of God. My favorite is Not Things Fall Apart. But the middle one no longer achieves gestures to the problematic that the community sends this man to school in England. He came back. And they posed a question. What are you going to do for us? The market women donate small amounts of money. The farmers donate small amount of money. Now you go to school, you got your BA, what do you do? That is how I went to school. When I was in college, I was sending my brother to school. When I left college, I was sending other people to school. When people go to school now, the first thing they think is, what car am I going to buy? When do I get my mortgage note? And as those create the core principle of having education, it begins to damage the bigger projects that give back to ideas that you mentioned. And today we go back to Africa and say, let's build a bigger Pan-African solidarity. It's going to be a lot of work. I don't want to sound depressing because I'm by nature an optimist, but I also understand all this pragmatism and the time in which we live in and the struggles that you and I have to keep engaging. There's always different narratives. we have to overcome the narratives of silence and move to the narrative of positive collective solidarity so that the weaker members can do well. Thank you.